I look at London, where you have a terrible mayor, terrible mayor, and it's been so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law.
It was supposed to be a routine press appearance, another measured soundbite from Sir Keir Starmer, carefully crafted, cautious and controlled. But in a shocking turn of events, Donald J. Trump, unpredictable, unfiltered and utterly unafraid, detonated a live grenade into the heart of Britain's political elite, and in the blast radius stood the Labour leader, blindsided, exposed and visibly shaken. Broadcasted live to millions across both sides of the Atlantic, the confrontation wasn't just a political jab, it was a calculated ambush. And it worked. Trump, mid-speech, veered off script, eyes locked on the camera, voice cutting like steel, and unleashed a ruthless, unscripted attack on Keir Starmer's leadership, moral record, and even his silence during Britain's darkest political decisions. Keir Starmer is not a leader, Trump declared, his tone chilling. He's a puppet. He stood by while his country was dragged into chaos, and now he wants power he never earned. Gasps erupted online within seconds. Starmer humiliated was trending across social platforms. Commentators scrambled. Newspapers froze their front pages. Inside Labour HQ, aides began frantically drafting statements, but it was already too late. The damage was done. A primetime transatlantic political assassination. And Starmer didn't even see it coming, because this wasn't just personal. This was strategic. Trump, preparing for his own thunderous re-entry into the White House, has increasingly turned his sights abroad, naming allies, exposing enemies, and reshaping alliances through fear and force. Britain was never going to be exempt, and in Starmer, Trump saw a symbol of what he detests most. Polished restraint masquerading as leadership. The Labour leader's past suddenly resurfaced, weaponised live on air. His former role as Director of Public Prosecutions. He prosecuted people for speech, Trump said. He turned the law into a political weapon. That's not justice, that's tyranny. Every syllable echoed like a sledgehammer through the halls of Westminster. The UK media machine ignited. Within minutes, broadcasters were splicing Trump's words into emergency segments. Former allies of Starmer were silent Tory MPs, predictably smirked. But it wasn't the right that worried Labour. It was the crumbling confidence of their own base. Messages flooded local party offices. Is this true? Why isn't Keir responding? Why is Trump saying what our own leaders won't? And while Keir stood behind a podium later that evening, tense, rehearsed, eyes flickering, the tremble in his voice betrayed the chaos beneath. I don't respond to foreign provocations, he said, especially from those who don't understand British values. But the statement fell flat, because the truth is, Trump does understand one thing with brutal clarity: weakness. And he just painted Starmer as the face of it. Even more dangerously, Trump's attack wasn't just against Starmer the man, it was a direct shot at the British establishment. He tied Keir to the failures of the lockdown years, the economic stagnation, the rise in crime and the collapse in trust. London is burning, he said, and you think this man is the answer. There was no nuance, only fire. It was the kind of moment that rewrites headlines, rewires elections, and redefines legacies. In America, Trump's words energised his base. In Britain, they shattered the illusion that Starmer was untouchable. Suddenly, the Labour leader found himself not just in a political debate, but in a moral crucible, accused, exposed, and with a population now questioning what they once accepted. And then came the silence. No defence from the palace, no rebuke from the US embassy. Even the Prime Minister remained curiously absent, as if waiting to see which way the public wind would blow. Only Nigel Farage, smirking in a late-night interview, dared to say what others were thinking. Trump just said what half the country has been screaming for years, and beneath it all, the deeper, darker question: why now? What does Trump know? Who fed him the dirt? Why did he choose this exact moment, weeks before Labour's final conference, just as polls were tightening? Inside Whitehall, panic turned to paranoia. Names were whispered, leaks suspected. A late-night call to Washington went unanswered. The Foreign Office denied any coordination, but some MPs now believe this was no accident, that Trump's ambush was part of a wider plan to destabilise Starmer before he ever steps near number 10. And if that's true, then this is just the beginning. What secret intel did Trump really have before going live? Who inside the British establishment wanted Starmer exposed? And why? And what will happen when the king is finally forced to respond? The fallout was immediate, not in days, not in hours. But within minutes, Britain's political equilibrium, already fragile, already fraying, began to unravel like a rope under strain. This wasn't just a foreign insult. This was a full-scale moral indictment of Keir Starmer's character, his past and his ambitions. It pierced deeper than any Prime Minister's question time ever could, and behind the scenes, the tremors had already reached the monarchy. Inside Buckingham Palace, aides began drafting internal briefings, not because Trump's words merited an official response, but because the public reaction could no longer be ignored. Whispers of royal discontent started to rise. Charles, known for his quiet scrutiny and measured neutrality, was said to be deeply concerned by what the Trump takedown implied. And not about America, but about Britain's readiness to lead itself. Because at its core, this wasn't about a squabble between two politicians. It was a moral rupture. Trump had exposed something the British public had long felt, but never fully articulated, that beneath Starmer's polished exterior lies an unsettling absence of conviction, a hollow centre, too eager to please, too slow to act. In a moment when the nation craves clarity, courage and authenticity, Starmer offered scripts. Trump, brash as ever, seized this vacuum. "You've got a guy over there," he thundered, "who bows to Europe, bends to the radical left and won't even defend his own police from rioters. Is that leadership or is that surrender?" Across the UK, it was like a wound reopened. Memories of shattered shops, silent streets and a government too cautious to name the chaos. Trump didn't name specific events. He didn't need to. The British public filled in the blanks themselves. BLM protests spiralling into vandalism. Illegal migrants escorted like diplomats through Dover. Knife crime skyrocketing while Met officers were told to review their tone. Trump's words weren't facts, they were fire, and the people were already cold and angry. Inside the Labour Party, a civil war began to smoulder. Shadow ministers clashed over whether to counterattack or lay low. Some urged a statement of strength, a televised response, maybe even an interview, but others feared it would only legitimise Trump's assault. Starmer, caught between pride and panic, did neither. He vanished. For nearly 48 hours, the man who claims to be the next Prime Minister was invisible. No press, no tweets, no rallying cry. The silence screamed louder than any speech. Meanwhile, the Tories, usually divided, often dysfunctional, sensed blood. They didn't defend Trump, but they didn't need to. Rishi Sunak, always cautious, simply said, "We'll stand firm in our own British values." A sentence so bland it vanished in seconds. But it made Starmer's absence even louder, because in politics, perception is power. And right now, Starmer looked powerless. Then came the leaks. A confidential briefing from Labour's election war room was leaked to the press. It described the Trump ambush as a calculated reputational crisis. It admitted that Starmer's previous record as DPP could be easily mischaracterised by foreign actors. It even acknowledged that some internal focus groups had raised concerns about his emotional disconnect with working-class voters. The damage was nuclear. The British public, already suspicious, now saw confirmation that Labour had been preparing for this moment, but not to defend against it, but to survive it. The question was no longer, did Trump go too far? It was, why did he hit so close to the truth? And then the king moved. Not publicly, not with statements, but with silence that said everything. An upcoming private meeting between Charles and Starmer, originally meant as a gesture of confidence in the event of a Labour election win, was postponed indefinitely. No official reason, no scheduling conflict, just vanished. Political analysts went into overdrive. Was it a rebuke, a warning, or a quiet declaration that the monarchy would not be dragged into this storm? Inside Labour, desperation reached its peak. Advisers urged Starmer to show strength, to reclaim the narrative. They crafted a rebuttal styled like a wartime address. It was heavy on patriotism, tradition and stability. But when Starmer rehearsed it in front of his closest circle, he stumbled. Not over words, but over conviction. He didn't believe the fire he was reading because Starmer wasn't angry, and he was embarrassed. Embarrassed that a foreign populist had struck him down in seconds. Embarrassed that his past decisions, or decisions he thought buried in bureaucracy, had become moral charges. And perhaps most damning of all, embarrassed that he could not find a single British voice willing to defend him on principle alone, because this wasn't just about Trump. It was about the entire system. The crisis had entered its final act. But not with a resolution, no redemption, no revenge, only silence spreading like rot through the foundations of the Labour Party and the nation's already fractured political soul. In the days following Trump's second strike, Keir Starmer was no longer a leader on the brink. He was a man standing in the ruins of his own political architecture, blinking into the wreckage and still hoping no one would notice the collapse. But they had noticed. The people were watching, waiting, and they saw everything. Behind closed doors, panic had mutated into paralysis. Every attempt to shift the narrative failed. A televised appearance on BBC was scrapped at the 11th hour after rehearsals left aides deeply alarmed. A planned speech on Labour's economic vision was shelved entirely. Instead, Starmer delivered a pre-recorded message, wooden, sterile, devoid of the urgency gripping the country. "We must not let foreign influence divide us," he intoned. But it wasn't division that haunted the public, it was doubt. Deep, biting, irreversible doubt about his strength, about his truth, about whether he ever had the fire to lead. And then came the polling collapse. Just 1 week after Trump's ambush, Labour's double-digit lead had evaporated. Swing voters, the lifeblood of Starmer's entire strategy, began drifting away not towards the Conservatives, but into something more dangerous, apathy. Disillusion, silence, the same silence that brought Brexit to life, that decimated the Liberal Democrats, that punished Corbyn into political exile, and now it threatened to devour Starmer whole. It wasn't just political failure, it was moral failure, because Trump had framed it not as a debate over policies, but a war over principles. He forced the British public to ask, who will fight for you when the chaos comes? Who will stand, not stammer, when foreign powers, street mobs or corrupt institutions rise? And when Starmer had the chance to answer when the country was holding its breath, pleading for a sign of courage, he offered only shadows, and still the betrayal deepened. Reports surfaced from inside Labour's comms team that elements of Starmer's past had been deliberately downplayed to protect his image. Questions about his role in high-profile prosecutions, concerns over his stance on speech policing, alleged pressure on journalists not to dig too far. Now, in the wake of Trump's brutal spotlight, these stories erupted like oil fires. Headlines screamed of cover-ups and character laundering. Even legacy outlets, once loyal defenders of Starmer's measured approach, The Guardian ran a front page titled "The Silence of a Leader." The Telegraph called it "the collapse of composure." The Sun simply said "exposed." But the most lethal blow came not from newspapers, it came from within. An anonymous letter, allegedly from a senior Labour official, leaked to several outlets. It described Starmer's leadership as a product of fear, not vision. It accused him of purging dissent not out of strength, but insecurity. It detailed late-night meetings where Starmer would rehearse responses to imaginary crises, but freeze when real ones came. The letter ended with one chilling line: "The public deserves courage. We gave them a ghost." And then the final humiliation. At the Remembrance Day service, surrounded by Britain's political and military elite, Keir Starmer arrived looking weary, distant and isolated. As the national anthem played, cameras zoomed in and captured something the country would never forget. Charles, King of the United Kingdom, turned slightly toward the crowd, away from Starmer. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rude, but it was noticed, a subtle gesture, a signal. And in the court of public opinion, it was deafening, because here stood the would-be Prime Minister, and even the monarch had turned his face. The symbolism was crushing. and the message was clear. Legitimacy cannot be inherited through polls or platitudes. It must be earned through fire. And Starmer, in the eyes of millions, had not stepped into the flames. He had fled them. Meanwhile, Trump's grip on the narrative remained ironclad. He released a follow-up video directly addressing the British people. "You deserve strength," he said, his voice calm, almost paternal. "Not someone who hides behind scripts, not someone who fears confrontation. You're better than that." It was a masterclass in manipulation, and it worked. Viewership soared. British comments flooded in, some angry, some mocking, but many quietly agreeing, and that was the true terror for Labour. Not that people agreed with Trump's politics, but that they believed his assessment, that Keir Starmer, for all his credentials and careful language, could not weather a real storm. Because real leadership isn't built in press rooms, it's forged in chaos. What began as a transatlantic insult had now metastasized into a full-blown moral crisis gripping the entire United Kingdom. This was no longer about Keir Starmer. It wasn't even about Trump. It was about something far more dangerous. The collapse of belief itself, belief in institutions, belief in leaders, belief that Britain still knew who it was or what it stood for. And in the vacuum left behind, something darker had begun to rise. As the dust settled from Starmer's failed national address, a new wave of anger surged across the country. But it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, cold, final. It whispered through working class towns that once cheered Labour parades. It echoed through old trade union halls, now filled with silence and confusion. The voters who once held their noses and backed Starmer as the lesser evil began to ask a more dangerous question. What if there is no lesser anymore? What if they're all the same? This wasn't political fatigue. This was ideological abandonment. A feeling that Westminster no longer represented Britain, that behind every promise was a script, behind every handshake a calculation, and Starmer, whether by fault or misfortune, had become the ultimate symbol of that betrayal. The man who had everything, intellect, experience, momentum, but somehow lost the one thing he could never afford to lose: trust. Meanwhile, the right-wing media machine smelled blood and moved in for the kill. GB News ran nightly segments titled The Ghost of Number 10, replaying Starmer's blank stare and hollow tone in slow motion, overlaid with haunting music and historic quotes from Churchill, Thatcher, even Attlee. The message was clear. Those leaders believed. Starmer only managed. And in a country desperate for moral certainty, management was not enough. Even more devastating was the reaction from former allies. Veteran Labour figures from the old guard to the Blairite era began giving cautious interviews. They didn't call for his resignation. They didn't need to. Instead, they used a more effective weapon: doubt by implication. Phrases like "Keir's strength is behind the scenes," or "it's not always about speeches," were repeated like eulogies at a funeral no one wanted to attend. Tony Blair, the last Labour Prime Minister to win a general election, declined to comment, but when asked offhand if Starmer had what it took to defeat populism, he paused, looked down and simply said, "It takes more than cushion." That sentence went viral. And in this growing void of leadership, something unthinkable began to happen. Farage rose again. Yes, Nigel Farage, the eternal spectre haunting the centre-left, seized the opportunity like a wolf returning to a weakened village. He took to the airwaves, not to defend Trump, but to declare what many were already thinking. This is the final proof that Westminster no longer understands Britain. The people are screaming and the elites are whispering among themselves. His words landed like thunder, not because they were new, but because they were suddenly believable. The idea that Labour was no longer a vehicle of the working class, but of urban technocrats, corporate lawyers and committee-made values had now entered the bloodstream of the national consciousness Starmer's background in law. Once seen as a virtue, now looked like a velvet cage. Every attempt to present himself as for the people now read like theatre authenticity had left the building. And it wasn't coming back. And then came the Royal Observer editorial, written anonymously but clearly sanctioned from high circles. The piece didn't attack Starmer directly. Instead, it posed a haunting question. What happens when the nation no longer recognises itself in those who claim to lead it? The implication was terrifying, not only for Labour, but for the entire political class, because Starmer's implosion hadn't just exposed a man, it had exposed a generation.